in your homework, so it shouldn't be too difficult to breeze through that. And then we will introduce chapter 8. Now, before I leave the Epicureans, of course, the founder of Epicurean thought was a fellow by the name of Epicurus. That should be a no-brainer. Because I'm trying to get through this quickly, I did want to note for you that a starting point of Epicureanism is their acceptance of atomist metaphysics. You may remember atomism as one of the pre-Socratic schools of thought. Atomists held that reality is fundamentally material. They held the view that reality is fundamentally material. Remember, they said that the only things that exist in the cosmos is this peculiar stuff called matter, material substance, and this empty space that they called what? Void. All that exists is matter and the void. And this stuff, matter, they believed, ultimately reduces to these indestructible and infinitely small things called atoms. That's where we got our concept of atoms from. Now, guess what we are made up of? We are made up of atoms, folks. We are beings that are best understood in terms of our materiality. Take a guess what the Epicureans believed that there was no legitimate reason to believe in. Any takers? They believed that there was no legitimate reason for us to believe that our true self was this immaterial thing that resides in our physical self. In other words, the ghost in the machine theory was not something that they would have taken seriously. Or the soul inside of the shell might be another way of putting it. We are fundamentally material beings. This is one of the reasons why they believe that we really had nothing to fear in what? Yes. Yeah, it had nothing to do with the Socratic view that God would not punish a just man. It had to do with the fact that they believed that there was no good reason to believe that there would be a you anymore after you died. Because after all, everything that you know, or think you know, you get through experience. And you experience things through your what? Yes, through your senses. And these images and experiences that you get are dependent upon your having working sensory apparatus. So it stands to reason that when your sensory apparatus isn't working anymore, that you will not be having any experiences. It stands to reason that there's no rational reason to believe that there is even a you. Now, for some of us, and I think I mentioned this before, for some of us, this is a liberating thought. For the Epicureans, it was a liberating thought too. Because remember, what did most of them believe about the afterlife? It would not be a pleasant place. Most people believed at that time in that place called Hades. Hades was not a particularly bad place, but it also wasn't what? It wasn't a good place either. According to the myths, you would be a mere shade or a shadow of your former self. Not a good place. So it is a liberating idea to think, well, there's no good reason to believe that there is a place where things will be worse for me, because there will be no me. Now, of course, many people, when they think about this, I'm going to stop existing at some time? Well, number one, the Epicureans might say, who do you think you are to think that you are so important that you're going to live forever? The person who holds that attitude misunderstands their place in the universe. You are a physical being just like all the other sentient physical beings. You just have opposable thumbs and the capacity for rational thoughts. You misunderstand your place in the cosmos. You think that you're more than you are. And by the way, you're actually better off if you don't think you're more than you are. Because they would say you have a more rational understanding of your place in the cosmic order. You too will die. And even if give me 30 seconds, and even if death is the end, you shouldn't think of it as a bad thing. And I'll admit my bias here. I am joyous about it because I value my life a lot more than my mother does. I'm willing to go on the record saying that. I sound like a bad son. I value my life much more than my mother does. Because I believe that my life is a finite commodity. So to borrow that line, from the Poet Society that was borrowed from Uncle Walt Whitman and some others of the Romantic poets, I'm here to suck the marrow out of life. In other words, I know that life is full of what? Pain and misery. But I know it's also potentially what? A place of beauty and joy. It's called accepting life in its finitude, accepting life on its finite terms, and being willing to, revel in it. Now, they believed that some of the chief things to value in life were not material possessions, was not, gritty pleasures. They believed in what we would call moderate hedonism. That is, they believed that seeking... Hold that thought a minute. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. They believed that pleasure was a good, but they believed that when we went out and sought massive amounts of gritty pleasures, as I like to call them, that you are more likely to do yourself harm in the long run. That was my diatribe I left off on last time. What's the movie? Train Spotting. That was my Train Spotting rant last time. It says, yeah, taking particular drugs might feel really, really good. But if you notice that it wrecks your body in a very short order, and if you recognize that you will need more and more and more of the stuff, if you realize that all of the other things that used to give you pleasure will no longer give you joy anymore, your rational mind will tell you what? Better not do any freebase from time to time. In other words, you'd be better off not doing these things, even if they give you momentary and very intense pleasures. Because they suggest that the best pleasures are the ones that are... They suggest the best pleasures are the ones that are enduring pleasures. And they also suggest that these kind of pleasures are ultimately the better ones. True happiness is to be found through the intellectual pleasures. And by the way, by the intellectual pleasures, I don't just mean sitting around and reading books and stuff. They also included what we would call psychological pleasures. One of the chiefest of pleasures for them was this. One of the chiefest of pleasures for them was friendship. Because if you find true friends, and by the way, folks, you probably found that's not an easy thing to do. If you find true friends, those friends will be immense sources of pleasure, because they can be with you through quote-unquote thick and thin. You can help one another get through the bad times, and you enjoy together the good times. Friendship is one of the potentially most enduring pleasures. Now, your garden variety intellectual pleasures are also valuable and potentially enduring. Because, and I know I said this last time, I know I'm at that stage where it's all going to begin to go downhill. I know that. I've come to terms with that. It all goes downhill from here, physically. And that's why, of course, I will hopefully have cultivated these other things in my life that will be able to sustain me. You know, book clubs and things of that nature. Yeah, the fact is, and this is another reason why, if you like sports, it is probably good to cultivate an interest in sports that are ones that you can play throughout your entire life at some point. Because you know what happens to people who took a lot of effort and time to play the very physical sports that take young bodies to be able to handle. Many of them go through massive depression once they can no longer play. Probably should have played tennis, pal. Granted, your knees can go bad and so forth, but people can play tennis and so forth, you know, into their later phase of life. I didn't say they were as physically good at it, but I'm saying you're probably not going to be playing tackle football in your 60s. You can certainly, you know, play tennis. You can certainly do these other things. You're better off pursuing things that will help you to enjoy things, but are also enduring. Mr. Peters, I'm sorry.
We're kind of far from it, but I took a note, so we're good. So Aristotle kind of believed that excess was good because then you could tune yourself backwards. And then the Stoics contend you are better off thinking less than you are, so that you do not become arrogant in the cosmic order. So how do you square those two positions?
Well, let me backtrack. Aristotle wouldn't say excess is good. He would say that if you err on the excessive side of virtue rather than on the deficient side, you're slightly better off.
Okay.
Yeah, he would have never said excess of a character trait is good, but the reason he would have said you're better off if you are excessive in most cases than if you're deficient. Because it's easier, usually, to tone back that excessiveness than it is to cultivate a trait that doesn't really exist in you at all. This is why he would say the person who has too much courage is probably easier to bring to the moderate level of courage than it is for the cat to make the coward courageous. Because the coward doesn't have any courage to begin with. And it tends to take more work to cultivate something that's not really there at all. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm glad that I'm going to talk about Mr. Peters' next point. Oh, one thing I didn't mention before I talk about that point. The Epicureans did believe that society was not a good thing. That common society did not bring the best out of people. It brought out materialism and greed, and it pointed people towards things that ultimately won't make them happy. This is why they advocated dropping out of society, and you may have read this in the text. Epicurus founded his own society called this. He founded his own society that's gone down in history. It was simply called the Garden. If you remember reading about this in the textbook, guess what the Garden of Epicurus might have reminded you a little bit of? A commune of sorts. The only prerequisite of membership was that you were like-minded with people of the community, that you sought to live a simple, good life. And I want to emphasize that. The idea that they believed that the simple things in life and living a simple life was more conducive to happiness. And I don't want to belabor this point too much, but this is one point in which the Cynics and the and the Epicureans agreed. They believed that indulging in highfalutin pleasures was not likely to make you happy in the long run. They believed that having complex lives with all kinds of difficulties that you had to deal with on a daily basis was not going to make you happy. This is one of the reasons why when people say, follow your dreams, run your own business. I'm like, why would you want to go and do something like that? How much more complicated would one's life become in that point? I know people who run their own business and their whole lives end up being consumed by their business. And they work a lot harder for ultimately what usually? For a lot less. They actually complicated their lives. They actually complicated their lives. But yeah, all things considered, simplifying things is probably better. And I guess I'll go contemporary American. You've noticed these TV shows they have on the cable channels where these people downsizing into these tiny houses. I'll go on record saying I think that this is to some extent dumbass. That's the technical term for it. And here's why. I imagine these people aren't showing you the storage trailers they have. Because after all, if you have an actual job, you probably have to own more than one suit. So the idea of, well, where are you going to put all your stuff if you have this dinky little closet or no closet at all? They've got to have a damn storage, trailer out back or something. So I think it's kind of silly and extreme. But they do at least have this right. The person who needs a McMansion to be happy is probably less happy. Number one, because their mortgage probably looks like this. And how much do you got to do just to keep up with the mortgage? And you'll own that house in 35 years. I plan to be dead in 35 years. Oh, that's just a fact. You'll own it in 35 years. You'll have worked your entire life for something that you never even technically owned. And if you have to pay that much money for it, you're likely working a lot more hours and a lot more stressed out. This is perhaps why having something lesser, but something that's paid for and you don't have to worry about, is more likely in the long term conducive to happiness, even if it is thoroughly un-American. Even if it is thoroughly un-American. I personally prefer, less. Not radically less. But I actually prefer the life with less. Even if people look down on me for not having a McMansion. I used to care about that stuff. I don't care about that stuff anymore. It's partly because I know it's more trouble than it's worth. And I'll repeat on film what I also know I'll be dead soon. I mean, in the grand scheme of things. Oh, and that's not something to be depressed about. If your life stinks, it's something you should be happy about, number one. And number two, the fact that life is short is something that I said before. I think that gives life more value. I'm going to enjoy the little bit of time that I got to the best of my ability. And that's also one of the reasons why I'm not in the business of trying to go out and wreck my body. Because I know if I've only got 70 odd years, I'd at least like the physical machine to operate decently for those 7 years. I'm talking quality of life here, folks. I certainly don't want to be one of those people, and this is going to sound really politically incorrect, but I don't mind saying it. I would not like to be one of those people carted around on oxygen. It just looks too what to me?
Depressing.
Yeah, it looks depressing, it looks painful, and I'll admit, and this is very unstoic of me, I'm kind of vain. I think the worst thing to feel is pity, or to be pitied. I don't want anyone to ever pity me. Pity is the lowest insult I can think of. I didn't make that up. I stole that idea from the philosopher Nietzsche. I hope I don't live long enough to be pitied. That would hurt worse than anything else. I think that's vanity. Now, here's the big deal, the big show. Stoicism. Now you might ask, why all this lead up to Stoicism? Well, what the author was trying to do was to suggest that Stoicism will be one of several approaches that thinkers had to dealing with life on life's terms. Life can be potentially very what? Very harsh, very cruel. Many people's lot in life is not a good one. Thus, you are best off if you develop a life philosophy that helps you to deal with life on life's terms. Now, you probably gathered from the text that Stoicism is a little more complicated than Cynicism and Epicureanism. Stoicism also looks a lot more, and I'll say it, a lot more religious than Epicureanism and Cynicism. And if you notice that, good. You drew the right inference. Now, according to Stoicism, this is Stoic metaphysics. This might show up on a test. Hint, hint. They believe that everything that exists is part of what they called the logos. Now, this word logos actually has many disseminating meanings. The same Greek word is where we get the word logic and reason from. But in Stoicism, take a guess what this word logos is oftentimes directly translated to. It's a three-letter word. God. Yeah, it often translates directly as God. Now keep in mind, the logos is not what most regular Americans have in mind when they think about God. For them, the logos was a dispassionate and perfectly rational I might describe it as being the dispassionate and perfectly rational source of all being. If you remember this in the text, everything is part of the logos. In other words, the logos is not some big man in the clouds, checking things out and pointing at things, etc., etc. The logos is basically everywhere and at all times. And take a guess what is also part of the logos. Each and every one of you is part of the logos. Everything that exists is part of the logos. And this word is not in the text, but I'm going to drop it for you. This is one reason why Stoicism is sometimes described as a peculiar form of pantheism. This prefix, pan, loosely translates to our word nature. Your average American just says, hey man, I'm a pantheist. I worship nature. Nature's divine. We're all, well, that's a little bit different from the Stoic view. But if you hear an average Joe on the street say, I'm a pantheist. That's what you're likely to hear from him or her. He or she is likely to be wearing Birkenstocks, and you know, you get the idea. Not to stereotype too much. I hope I didn't insult anyone out there. Their pantheism is different from that. All their pantheism suggests is that everything is part of the divine. Every single thing that exists. And this is why every single thing technically has what? Every single thing or being has value and worth. Each and every one of you is a piece of the Logos. And guess what part of you is closest to the Logos? The rational part of you is closest to the Logos. This is why Stoicism counsels the person to live a rational life. Of course, then we have to define what did the Stoics mean by a rational life. And I'll lay it to you straight. If you want to live a good life, be ye like the Logos. If you want to live a good life, you should try to be as much like the Logos as possible. Which basically means to do what with your emotions? And many of you got this right in the homework. Detach yourself emotionally as much as you can. Not only will you be closer to the Logos when you do this, when you divorce yourself of your passions, but ultimately you will be able to carry out your purpose to the best of your ability. And ultimately your purpose in life, and this is my long-winded way of getting to Mr. Peters' earlier question, the purpose of life is not happiness, according to Stoicism. The purpose of life is